Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. So Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Jesus and his disciples at the last meeting before his arrest. Verse 1, chapter 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now before the feast of the Passover, this gives us a reference of time. Jesus is about to share a meal with his disciples. Jesus knew that his hour had come. Jesus lived his life in anticipation of this hour. In chapter 2, verses 4, he knew when it had not yet come. 2 verses 4, Jesus said to her, Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Up to this point, Jesus enjoyed a unique protection because his hour had not yet come. John 7:30 and John 8:20. John chapter 7, verse 30. Therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. John 8, verse 20. These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come. Jesus knew that his hour had come now. In John chapter 12, verses 23 to 27, he spoke of this awareness. But John chapter 12:23. But Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, let him follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. Jesus predicts his death on the cross. Verse 27, Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I come to this hour. His hour had come. Jesus' public ministry is over, and in close to 24 hours, Jesus will hang on the cross. This is the beginning of the end, and Jesus will use these last precious hours to minister to his disciples, that he should depart this world to the Father. The cross is not specifically mentioned in John 13:1, but casts a shadow over almost every word. We see the shadow of the cross over his hour had come. We see the shadow of the cross over love them to the end. But we also see the shadow of the cross over depart this world. It is phrased softly, but there is a hard reality underneath the soft cover. Jesus would only depart this world through the cross, having love. Surely Jesus had loved his disciples. He led them, taught them, and cared for them, protected them. What Jesus had given them already was more than any other teacher or leader could give his followers, having loved his own. There is a love Jesus had for all people, and then there is a love for his own. It isn't so much that Jesus' love is different, but the dynamic of the love relationship is different. The love of Jesus for his own is greater because it has a response, and love answers to love. Jesus has done some things for all men. He's also done all things for some men, his own who were in the world. He loved them to the end. Jesus had loved his own, but he hadn't finished loving them. He would love them to the end. The idea behind the phrase "to the end" is to the fullest extent, to the uttermost. To the end means to the end of Jesus' earthly life. Although the disciples gave up on him, he never gave up on them. Although they stopped thinking about Jesus and were only thinking of themselves, he never stopped thinking of them. Whose problems were worse, Jesus or the disciples? Who was concerned more for the other? He loved them to the end. To the end means a love that will never end. Jesus will never stop loving his own. It isn't a love that comes and goes, that is here today and gone tomorrow. To the end means a love that reaches to the fullest extent. Some translations have, he loved them to the uttermost. Jesus poured out the cup of his love to the bottom for us. Verse 2 to 5, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Verse 2, and supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Supper being ended. Some ancient manuscripts have that supper was now in progress instead of supper being ended. Supper was now in progress is a preferable reading to the variant supper having ended, because the sequel verses 12 to 30 makes it plain that supper hadn't ended. So when he had washed their feet, verse 12, so when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash my mother's feet. Verse 15, for I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Jesus identifies his betrayer. Verse 18, I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit, and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. Then the disciples looked at one another, perplexed about whom he spoke. Now there was a leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him, and Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. But no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. Having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately, and it was night. Supper had already begun when Jesus rose from the table and began to wash the disciples' feet. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot. Judas was led by the devil. Before the chapter is finished, John will show us the extent of Judas' depravity. Luke chapter 22, verse 3 describes how Satan entered Judas shortly before this. Verse 3, 22:3. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. It may well be that a better translation is the devil had already made up his mind that Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, should betray him. Satan was looking for a man to betray Jesus, and had probably been, cultivating Judas for a long time. But now the choice was made, Judas was his man. Judas, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands. This wasn't something that Jesus came to know just at this hour. In John chapter 3, verse 35, several years before in his ministry, Jesus said, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. But this means that at this particular time and in this particular circumstance, it was important that Jesus knew the Father had given all things into his hands. It was important because of the hour. Jesus is about to face the agony of crucifixion and the terror of standing in the place of guilty sinners before the righteous wrath of God the Father. At the same time, Jesus went into this situation as a victor, not as a victim. He could have backed out any time he wanted to because the Father had given all things into his hands. It was important because of the circumstances. Jesus is about to lower himself, literally stooping in humble service to his disciples. But as he serves in this humble way, he doesn't do it from weakness. He does it from a position of all authority, because the Father had given him all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God. Jesus didn't only know his authority, he also knew his relationship with God. He knew his identity as one who had come from God and as one who was going to God. Knowing his past with God the Father and his future with God the Father, what else could he do but glorify him in the present? Began to wash the disciples' feet. At this moment of deep meaning, Jesus did something that must have almost seemed crazy. He began to do the job of the lowest servant in the household. He began to wash the disciples' feet. At this critical moment in this evening before the torture of the cross, Jesus doesn't think of himself, he thinks about his disciples. Truly, this is loving them to the end. After all, Jesus' disciples treated him badly and were about to treat him even worse, forsaking him completely. Still, he loved them. Jesus completely gave himself to washing their feet. Look at how thorough he was in this work. First, he rose from supper, and Jesus laid aside his garments, which he had to remind him of what waited in just a few hours when he would be stripped of his garments and be crucified. Jesus then took a towel and girded himself. Finally, Jesus poured water into a basin. If Jesus wanted to just display the image of a servant, he would have had a servant or one of the disciples do all of this preparation work. He then would have quickly wiped the damp cloth on a few dirty feet and considered the job done. This would have given the image of servanthood and loving relationship, but Jesus gave himself completely to this work. This was an extreme act of servanthood. According to the Jewish laws and traditions regarding the relationship between a teacher and his disciples, a teacher had no right to demand or expect that his disciples would wash his feet. How much more unthinkable was it that the master would wash his disciples' feet? Charles Spurgeon wrote, "He disrobed himself, though angels longed to cast the imperial purple about his shoulders, with all things in his hand, he yet took a towel and wiped the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded." As Jesus went around the table, washing and drying the feet of his disciples, it was a dramatic scene. The disciples entered the room debating who was greatest in Luke 22:23. Then they began questioning among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. But by what he did, Jesus illustrates true greatness. It was customary that the lowest servant of the house would wash the feet of the guests as they came into the house, especially for a formal meal like this. For some reason, this didn't happen when Jesus and the disciples came into the room, so they ate their meal with dirty feet. This was more awkward than we might think. First, because of the sandals they wore and the roads that they walked on, the feet would be dirty. Second, the disciples would eat a formal meal like this at a table known as a triclinium. This was a low coffee table height, U-shaped table. The guests would sit, and their status at the meal was reflected by how close they were seated to the host or leader of the meal. Because the table was low, they didn't sit on chairs. They leaned on pillows with their feet behind them. This meant that the dirty feet could be unpleasantly close to the table during the meal, so the unwashed feet were conspicuous. So why didn't any of the disciples do this first? Any of the disciples would have gladly washed Jesus' feet, but they couldn't wash his without having to be available to wash the other's feet, and that would have been an intolerable admission of inferiority among their fellow competitors for the top positions in the disciples' hierarchy, so no one's feet got washed. In all of this, Jesus essentially acted out a parable for the disciples. Jesus knew better that actions speak louder than words. So when he wanted to teach the crowd, arguing disciples about true humility, he didn't just say it, he showed it. And he showed it in a way that illustrated his whole work on behalf of his own. Jesus rose from supper, a place of rest and comfort. Jesus rose from his throne in heaven, a place of rest and comfort. Jesus laid aside his garments, taking off his covering. Jesus laid aside his glory, taking off his heavenly covering. Jesus took a towel and girded himself, being ready to work. Jesus took a form of a servant and came ready to work. Jesus poured water into a basin, ready to clean. Jesus poured out his blood to cleanse us from the guilt and penalty of sin. Jesus sat down again after washing their feet in John chapter 13, verse 12. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Jesus sat down at the right hand of God the Father after cleansing us. We know this whole lesson did stick powerfully. Decades later, when Peter wrote to the Christians about humility, he put it like this in 1 Peter chapter 5. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. More literally, Peter wrote, wrap the apron of humility around yourself. Surely what Jesus did here stuck in his mind and in his heart. Verse 6 to 11, Jesus overcomes Peter's objection to washes his feet. Verse 6, then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you, for he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. You shall never wash my feet. Knowing the layout of a typical table and Passover meal, there is reason to believe Peter was seated at the far end of the U-shaped table from Jesus. Probably Jesus came to Peter last of all. Maybe Peter thought, all these guys missed the point by letting Jesus wash their feet. He wants to protest, proclaim that he's too great and we are too unworthy to have him wash our feet. So Peter makes this dramatic statement. At the same time, Peter clearly felt uncomfortable with having Jesus perform such a humble act of service for him. This example of the servant's heart of Jesus made Peter and the others look pretty proud by comparison. If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. If we do not accept the humble service of Jesus to cleanse us, we have no part with him. Jesus doesn't wash our feet literally as he did for the disciples, but he did humbly die on the cross to cleanse us, and we must receive it. This foot washing is a powerful lesson in humility, but it is more than that. The deeper meaning here is that Jesus had no fellowship with those who have not been cleansed by him. Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Peter, in his request to be fully washed, is so reluctant to let Jesus do as he wants. Peter wants to tell Jesus what to do. Jesus, though, the servant of all, is still God's appointed leader. He won't allow Peter to monopolize this situation and set things on a wrong course. Sometimes we show a servant's heart by accepting the service of others for us. If we only serve and refuse to be served, it can be a sign of deeply rooted, well-hidden pride. Man's humility doesn't begin with the giving of service, it begins with the readiness to receive it. For there can be much pride and condescension in our giving of service. Verse 12 to 17, Jesus explains what he did and calls his disciples to follow his example. Verse 12, so when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who has sinned greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. You also ought to wash one another's feet. Jesus plainly and powerfully says that this is the attitude that must mark his followers, especially the leadership of the church. You also ought to wash one another's feet. Some try to fulfill this with foot-washing ceremonies. Surely if it is done with the right heart, it can be a blessing, but Jesus wasn't talking about a ceremony here. Every year they hold a theatrical feet washing, and when they have discharged this empty and bare ceremony, they think they have done their duty finally and are then free to despise their brethren. But more, when they have washed 12 men's feet, they cruelly torture all Christ's members and thus spit in the face of Christ himself. This ceremonial comedy is nothing but a shameful mockery of Christ. At any rate, Christ does not enjoying an annual ceremony here, but tells us to be ready all through our life to wash the feet of our brethren. John Calvin wrote that. If we are going to wash one another's feet, we should be careful of the temperature of the water. Sometimes we try to wash the lawn with our water too hot. We are too fervent and zealous. Sometimes our water is too cold. We are cold and distant in heart to them. The temperature needs to be in the middle. We should also remember that we can't dry clean someone else's feet. In Ephesians 5:26, it says that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. Jesus washes with the washing of water by the word. We should use the same water in ministering to others. Wash one another's feet. We, like the disciples, would gladly wash the feet of Jesus, but he tells us to wash one another's feet. Anything we do for each other that washes away the grime of the world and the dust of defeat and discouragement is foot washing. In the world, they criticize this is the business of a public press, and it's very much the business of private circles. Hear how gossips say, "Do you see that spot? What a terrible walk that man must have had this morning. Look at his feet. He's been very much in the mire, you can see, for there are the traces upon him." That is the world's way. Christ's way is very different. He says nothing but takes the basin and begins to wash away the stain. Do not judge and condemn, but seek the restoration and the improvement of the erring. Charles Spurgeon. If you know these things, happy are you if you do them. The theory of being a servant isn't worth very much, but the practice of being a servant pleases God and fulfills our calling. If there is a position in the church where the worker will have to toil hard and get no thanks for it, take it and be pleased with it. If you can perform a service which few will ever speak to do themselves, or appreciate when performed by others, yet occupy it with holy delight, covet humble work, and when you get it, be content to continue in it. There is no great rush after the lowest places. You will rob no one by seeking them. Charles Spurgeon. Verse 31 to 32, Jesus saw the cross as supreme glorification, not supreme humiliation. Verse 31, so when he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. It is emphasized in these two verses, glorified, 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 glorified. 5 references to glory in 2 verses. Jesus saw the cross in terms of glory instead of humiliation. Verse 33, Jesus plainly reveals his soon departure. Verse 33, little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You will seek me as I said to the Jews, where I am going you cannot come. So now I say to you, I shall be with you a little while longer, where I am going you cannot come. This would have been an earthquake to the disciples. They had literally left everything to follow Jesus and expected to be high-ranking officials in his government when he took political control of Israel as Messiah. They followed him for 3 years, enduring a lot, and now he says, I'm leaving you. Jesus will explain this dramatic statement and comfort the disciples concerning this all the way through the end of John 14, which we'll be teaching coming up. Verse 34 and 35, in light of the coming storm, Jesus tells of a new commandment. Verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. A new commandment. This specific ancient Greek word used here for new here implies freshness, or the opposite of outworn, rather than recent or different. It isn't that this commandment was just invented, but it will be presented in a new, fresh way, that you love one another. Whereas the Old Testament demanded that men should love their neighbors as themselves, the new law is that they should love the brethren better than themselves and die for their friends. As I have loved you, the command to love wasn't new, but the extent of love just displayed by Jesus was new, as would be the display of the cross. Love was newly defined from his example. By this all men know that you are my disciples. Love is the mark of the fellowship of true believers, and all other criteria are strictly secondary. In the text, we see the Lord Jesus loving men who did not deserve it. At the Lord's Supper, just after Jesus announced that one of them would betray him, the disciples got into a dispute about which of them was the greatest. But sometimes during the supper, Jesus got up to perform this task, which normally was the job of slaves. Since the foot washing came before Jesus mentioned the betrayer, the dispute among the disciples about which of them was the greatest probably came after the graphic lesson they had just observed. Not only were the disciples arguing, also Jesus knew that Judas was about to betray him, Peter was about to deny him, and that all the disciples would desert him. All of these sins show that the disciples didn't deserve Jesus' love. Also the fact that they needed to have their dirty feet washed and pictures their need for cleansing from sin. And we just like them all have dirty feet that Jesus needs to wash. In fact, the very reason Jesus came was to die in the place of dirty sinners so that they can be cleansed. Also, his example of humility in washing the disciples' feet gives us a practical example of how we can love those who don't deserve it, even as he has loved us. So these three themes are brought together: Jesus' love for those who don't deserve it, his examples of demonstrating his love through his humble service, and our need for Jesus to clean our sins. Christ's love, his humble service, and his cleansing our sins should be realities in our life. Sorry, it's short, but Father, we come to you in Jesus' name, thanking you for this opportunity, Father, of hearing your word, Father, that you would speak your word to us during this time, Father, playing your word in our hearts, that we may take it with us, that we may not sin against you, and we may be able to spread the gospel message of Jesus Christ and love into this world, Father. We thank you for all the blessings you bestow us here at Calvary Chapel downtown. We thank you for our visitors this morning. We pray a hedge of protection on each and every one of us here, Father, and give traveling mercies for those leaving, that we all may be able to be together at the next appointed time. We want to lift Pastor Russell up to you, Father, as he's going through this sinus thing, Father. Give complete healing from head to toe, Father, to be able to resume his thing that he does for you, Father. And we do thank you for all the things you're doing, and we do thank you, Father, for loving us. We thank you, Jesus, for saving us. We thank you, Holy Spirit, for convicting us and guiding us into all truth. And may you bless this time as we fellowship together before we go our separate ways. In Jesus' name, amen.
Praise the Lord. Shall we stand and finish in song? Mighty is our God. Mighty is our King. Mighty is our Lord. Ruler of everything. Glory to our God. Glory to our King. Glory to our Lord. Ruler of everything. Amen. Word for you.